Okay, all right. Hello, everyone. My name is Calvin Hughes, and thank you so much for being a part of this event today, the Muslim vote and the 2020 elections. Um, we are running a few minutes behind, and I apologize. This is technical issues that we're having always. This is Zoom. This is the world we live in. And oftentimes, when there are mistakes or issues in 2020, people just say 2020. So after that, everyone understands it's the kind of year we've been having. So there are a few housekeeping things I need to do. First, I want to say on behalf of the Muslim and Fawzia Jaffer Center for Muslim World Studies at FIU, I want to welcome everyone to our event once again. And we're also very grateful for the co-sponsorship of the Ruth K. and Shepard Broad Distinguished Lecture series, the Coalition of South Florida Muslim Organizations, or COSMOS, Emgage USA, and the Jaffer Institute for Interfaith Dialogue and Education at Miami-Dade College. And before I introduce the panelists, there's one more housekeeping note that I need to make here. I also want to I also have a personal thanks on behalf of Dr. Misbahi, the founding director of the Jaffer Center, to all of the panelists and the sponsors for this event today. He wanted me to say that, so there you have it, Dr. Misbahi. Okay, so we have an incredible event today that we are excited about. I must say that during my research, I learned a lot. And so I learned an enormous amount. So I don't want to keep you any longer. I want to introduce our first panelist, someone who I'm quite fond of and have been for a very long time. He's done a lot of work at FIU. He is a political science professor, distinguished in his own right for many, many things, being an expert on polling internationally and as well as locally here and domestically. So Dr. Eduardo Gamara, I want to thank you for being one of the panelists. So each panelist will have roughly 2 to 3 minutes to begin with an opening statement. So Mr. Gamara, I want to begin with you. Please begin.
Thank you very much, Calvin. Generous introduction. I too am very pleased to be here, and I want to thank my colleague Muadin Misbahi for this initiative and for always thinking of me to say something about an issue that I have not really studied that well, but that hasn't stopped me from trying to say a few things. So along those lines, in the context of this conference, and especially as we head into the 2020 elections, my focus, of course, has been largely on the Latino vote. And so a lot of what I'm going to say in the next couple of minutes really comes from my attempts at trying to understand Latinos in the context of the election, but more broadly, I would say how minority communities are essentially treated or looked at or understood in the context of electoral processes. And I simply want to limit my comments, at least in this introductory part, to two big issues. The first issue really has to do with how we research minority groups during electoral processes, or at least in moments leading up to elections. One of the critical things, of course, is that we don't really have the data, at least not from electoral registration, that basically allows us to understand what are the Muslim voters in the United States. Where do they come from? What are their national origins? Even what they think or what their stances are on key issues. That, of course, is something that really has sort of a birth defect, and that is when we register to vote, we often solely identify on the basis of our ethnic background, but it doesn't allow us to go deeper into what kinds of responses people might give. For example, on the Latino side, we would often, like we've argued for this for a long time, we'd like to see, for example, and not only when you can fill in the category Hispanic, for people to be able to fill in their national origin. That way, when people ask you very specifically, how did Cubans vote? How did Venezuelans vote? How did Colombians vote, et cetera? You might be able to give a more intelligent answer. And so part of what I'm saying is that we really don't know in a very detailed way, either how different minority groups are registering and how in the end they vote. But we can make some, some projections largely based on polling. But the data as such, the raw data as such, is not available or not available. So we need to, I think, especially as we move to study better the place of the Muslim community in the United States in electoral contests, it really is very, very important to think about how we study them, how we research, and what data is available to us. So that sort of is a very introductory.
Dr. Gamarra,
Hello?
thank
Yep.
you. And thank you very much, Dr. Gamarra. And I don't know if it's the internet connection on my end or on your end, but it's a little tough. It's a little delayed. So I'm not sure if there's something that you can do on your end, and the technical guys will tell them, but it's like you're saying something and then your words are catching up with what you are saying. So, but we will come back to you, Dr. Gamarra. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'll work
Dr.
on
Gamarra, go ahead.
what's happening over here.
Yes, sir. Okay, all right. And so Dr. Dario Moreno, a political science professor at FIU, a keen observer of Florida elections, and more particularly, he will provide some views on the Republican dynamics, the Latin Cuban votes as well, and et cetera. Dr. Moreno, if you're with us, go ahead.
Well, let me begin by saying three things that I think are key in understanding sort of how what obstacles Muslims as a voting bloc will face in based on the experience of Cuban Americans and Jewish Americans and sort of the history of ethnic politics in the United States. And let me begin by saying that one of the issues I see is the very issue of religion. In the United States, we kind of believe in this separation of religion and politics. And so people are very uncomfortable about talking about religions as voting blocs. And we see that in, for example, with the Catholic vote. Joe Biden, in order to make an appeal to the Catholic vote, let it be known that he carries a rosary wherever he goes. In one of his TV ads, he quotes John Paul II. And also in the 2012 election, we saw how presidential candidate Romney's Mormonism, or being a member of the Church of Latter-day Saints, wasn't an issue, but was mentioned often in a negative context. So even though religion matters, and we know it matters, there's a discomfort among political scientists, among commentators, among the public to see that connection. The second, and we saw this recently in the context of South Florida politics, and that is that whenever you emphasize one group, other groups often react negatively because they feel that they're not getting a similar amount of attention. So when Vice Presidential candidate Harris visited a Venezuelan store, Haitian Americans in Miami were upset because there were no events dealing with Haitians. And so there's always that problem when you're dealing with identity politics of you make you do something to please one groups and other groups get upset. And the third obstacle I see for the Muslim community and the Muslim vote is coherency. And it's a similar problems that Hispanics have. And Eduardo was talking about it, Dr. Gamara was talking about it in terms of distinguishing between different Hispanic groups by nationalities. And the attitude of a Muslim from India or Pakistan might be very different from one from Palestine or Iraq. And group cohesiveness, by the way, you know, one of the strengths of the Cuban vote is that image of group cohesiveness. And that's why you see these like crazy caravans for Trump down 8th Street and Coral Way are actually kind of an effective way of showing group cohesiveness and demonstrating that to the general public. So these are the kinds of obstacles that I see, not only for Muslims, but you see for every group in the United States. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Moreno, thank you very much. And I think it's interesting to note that we have almost 100 people who have joined already, and we're already getting questions from some of our listeners. So we're going to launch right into those very shortly. But before we get to that, I'd like to now introduce another panelist, Dr. Simon Chaudry. She is a professor of law at FIU, works on human and minority Muslim civil rights issues, including Islamophobia, the role of the legal system, what it plays, and into all of this. And I'm looking forward to hearing her comments like the other two panelists so far. So Dr. Chaudry, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Calvin. I'm going to take a slightly different tack, being that I'm a law professor and not a political scientist, and so I'm less concerned about the ways in which Muslim votes are formed in terms of blocks, etc. And I'm much more interested in the actual result of voting or not voting, or the consequences of voting or not voting. So before I say that, let me premise my comments, my brief comments, with the small data point that, in fact, Pew Trust has been collecting information on Muslim voters. ISPU has been collecting data on Muslim voters. So we are seeing data being now collected that tell us a little bit about how Muslims vote. And one of the things that has come out since 2017 onwards is that the majority of Muslim voters lean Democrat, probably from with a ratio of about 2 to 1, and they tend to be liberal in their sort of political bent. So having said that, it is incredibly important for Muslims to get out and vote, even if they're not voting as a concerted bloc. The fact that they do have some shared concerns means that, the only way to really make those concerns sort of heard, and also to have some sort of an impact on policy in general, is to get out and exercise the vote, not just at the presidential level, but of course also down ticket and in your state and local elections. So one of the reasons I think it's really important for Muslims to vote, and historically there has been lower voter turnout among Muslims than in other groups. We're seeing that change, and I think we're seeing that change because there used to be a truism that, the president really doesn't control a whole lot. It's sort of the deep state or the civil service, etc. The people who are career, political functionaries who actually make a difference. And so really, even if you vote for the president, it's not going to make a huge difference. We saw what an actual sort of fallacy that was we've seen that sort of unravel in the last 4 years. for instance, one of the first things that happened almost immediately after the election of Donald Trump was the so-called Muslim bans. The president holds an enormous amount of power in terms of his ability to control agencies as the executive. So when it comes to immigration, when it comes to things like education, housing, many of these issues that touch on Muslim lives quite, sort of intimately, are things that are sort of impacted by who is sitting in the White House. So the idea that, the president, the election of a president doesn't matter is actually really untrue. And it's something that needs to be sort of spread out widely, that in fact your vote for president and also downstream, all of these votes matters. And I'll sort of end here by also just pointing out that it has not been that long since people of color have had the ability to go to the polls unmolested. It took centuries to get the right to vote for women and for people of color, for Blacks and for Native Americans. And to think that we would waste the opportunity to exercise the franchise when other people have paid such a high cost to obtain that right for us is really unfortunate. It is not a civic minded way to think about sort of, your role in the world and in the United States. And this does in fact impact the world, because we are seeing all sorts of policies that are originating from the White House that impact the globe. So this is not just about sort of staying home and feeling, like you don't matter, but this is about a community, a responsibility that you have to the body politic and to other people that you live with in this country. So my two cents is this, that the Muslim vote, even if it's not a block, even if we don't vote as a block, we do have some shared interests. We are seeing shared targeting, right? We are being targeted as Muslims, and we have the ability to go out and make a difference in some key places, like, for example, Michigan, probably in South Florida, we have the ability to make a difference, and certainly New York, etc., even though that state will most likely be will go blue anyway.
Absolutely.
So there may not be a huge change in that state, but
I agree.
Given that, it is imperative that we exercise the franchise that has been hard fought and won for us by others.
That's right. Dr. Chaudry, thank you so much. And I will I obviously come back to you, but to your point that the Muslim vote matters, makes up 1% of the U.S., but critical and concentrated in the battleground states of Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and of course, right here in Florida. And we'll talk more about that in just a moment. Afifa Khalik from Emgage, someone was just asking, why was Emgage removed? Emgage has not been removed at all. And Afifa Khalik is in the house, as they say, the leading nonpartisan national Muslim voter advocacy group. She probably has a great overview. She likely has a great overview of the Muslim vote nationally, like Dr. Chaudry just gave us just a moments ago. So Afifa Khalik, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Calvin. Thank you, Mohsin Jaffer Center, and what an amazing panel. So I will be focusing mostly on Florida, and since our target audiences are mostly Florida-based, right? So why is Florida critical, and why is Muslim vote critical in Florida, or why should anyone take the Muslim voters seriously, right? Florida, we know that there is no path to victory for Trump without Florida, right? It's absolutely critical. 29 votes at stake. And considering the population of Muslim, right? We know that, Bush won Florida by 500 plus some votes, right? We know that Obama won Florida by 1% margin. Trump won Florida by 1% plus some margin, right? So it's within the margin of the victory is like so narrow that any community that has a tendency to vote by block can sway the elections anyways, right? And Muslim in Florida, we have like 120,000 Muslim that are registered voters in the state of Florida. That's a big enough number to be taken seriously, right? Though nobody can ignore it, especially in an election like 2020, where everyone is saying that this is different from any other election that we normally go out and mobilize out. So, and what's happening on the ground is pretty much reflective of that too. I've seen political parties have started taking Muslims vote more seriously. Candidates have started taking Muslim votes more seriously. You see more engagement and more activism from the other side to the Muslim vote, but at the same time, amongst the Muslim voters too. Like this energy that I'm seeing for the past 2 or 3 years in the election cycle is nowhere to be found. If we talk about 2008 or elections before that, or even 2010, and if we can look at the Muslim voter turnout alone, right? And I have some data around mid-year elections in 2010. It was around 32%. 2010 it was around 30% Muslim voter turnout. In 2018, it was around 53%, right? Amazing jump of Muslim voters we see. And the only difference between 2010 and 2014 and 2018 was 2016, that election year, right? And we see that there was an engagement because for the first time in the election history, anti-Muslim narrative was being used by political mainstream, right? And, though there are racial tensions exist in America all the time, but this was one time where an active target was done. And we have seen around late Herman King, when he was talking about the Muslim vote and attacks started happening, we have seen his poll numbers jumped up. And we saw that it was an impact, right? So some of the activism that we are seeing is as a result of Muslim voters being targeted directly by political party, but also realizing that Muslim voters are also tend to be more younger voter than any other faith group, right? And we have seen amongst all the younger voters this year, we have seen the primary election result where there's a large number of younger voters who have turned out. And that is being reflected both in activism at the polls, where they are actually turning out the votes, but also volunteering for elections, getting engaged in the party, running for offices, all of the activism is being seen. And they're amazing numbers and amazing work that many Muslim organizations, including Emgage, through Million Muslim Vote campaign are doing, and hopefully we'll see the outcome in this election cycle too.
Okay. All right. Afifa, thank you so much. So much information there. Wow. Thank you. Thank you very much. And now to the final panelist, Yasir Ballou, my friend for years with Cosmos. He's on the board there. He's also a prominent lawyer as well, and well-versed in the grassroots mobilization efforts that's taking place, all of the civil rights issues, any kind of courts issues that are taking place. He is the man to talk to. And also he's going to talk about the money aspect of it. Isn't that what politics is all about? Isn't that what motivates politics these days? And like it has been for decades now. Yasir, the floor is yours.
Calvin, can you hear me?
There you are. Yes, sir.
Okay. Sorry about that. Blame it on 2020. So Calvin, as you mentioned, the money really is an important critical issue. And I think that's probably why I'm starting last on this panel, because it's a painful issue to discuss. Saira and Dr. Gamara mentioned the data points. Afifa touched on the data points. What we really don't have data on at all is the money in terms of the Muslim community and what it contributes to campaigns. I work as part of Emgage PAC Florida's chair on Florida money, and I have an idea in terms of what the US is doing as well. The Muslim community in the United States is doing for national candidates and local candidates. And let me tell you, it's negligible. The difference that Muslim community is making in terms of money is very small. And we know that as important as the votes are, that's almost as important, if not more important, is where the money is, because the money gets you into the door in terms of conversations with politicians, with elected officials. Later on, they remember who gave them the money and what candidate, and I mean, what cause to support more. Unfortunately, that's the reality of it, right? We know that in September, the US presidential election brought in $383 million. We know that in the third quarter of 2020, the Democrats, including the presidential election, all Democratic races nationwide brought in $1.5 billion. The Muslim contribution to that is very small. And it's largely on track, but it's still, we know for a fact that it's very small compared to that $1.5 billion. One of the issues is there is a lack of cohesion in terms of effort. So we're trying through Emgage to provide that effort. There are other organizations throughout the United States that do a marvelous job as well, collecting money, bundling money, having candidates forums, things like that. The disconnect is a largely immigrant community saying, why should I give my hard-earned money to somebody who might lose in the end? And they've been burned several times as a result, right? And so there may have been big donors for Hillary Clinton, for example, and there were, we know that. There were big donors in Florida for the last governor's race, particularly Andrew Gillum. And we raised what we considered to be considerable amount of money, and then they ended up losing. How do you explain to a community that, hey, instead of building a mosque or an Islamic school or a charitable, a domestic violence shelter or something like that, give your money to a candidate who may or may not win? That's a difficult conversation to have. That's not a natural progression in terms of, okay, let's move on from votes to money. And so it becomes an issue. In addition to that, these organizations are sort of, just take Emgage, for example. Emgage raises money for itself, for its own operations, and then asks also probably the same group of donors for money for the PAC in terms of being able to donate to candidates. That becomes an issue as well. So the availability of funds is almost secondary, though. The information on getting small donors, we need Muslim community members to understand that $10, $20, $50, $100 will go a long way. And whatever they can do is important to donate. But the vast majority of the community, unfortunately, isn't there yet. And that's a bridge that we need to build upon quite quickly if we're going to make any real headwind in terms of political leadership as well, and in terms of political power.
Great points and a great segue to talk about. So do we really know what Muslim Americans think? It's been brought up a few times here about the cohesion in the community. Should we just assume that it's a monolithic community and that Muslim Americans, they all think alike, or how different are the opinions? And speaking of opinions and polls, I'll go back to Dr. Gamara. Do we really know, are there any polls out there that can tell us what Muslim Americans think and what direction they're going to go in politically, even though I did hear, I believe from Afifa, that many Muslim Americans are Democrats, but not all Muslim Americans are Democrats.
Yeah.
Dr. Gamara. Okay.
Can you hear me? All right.
Yes, sir.
That's very good. And let me just begin by saying that there are some very interesting surveys out there, including some that Emgage has been involved in, and there are I would say probably some of the best work that's out there right now is also from Pew, but it's, as I was saying at the beginning, it's not that deep. There are no real time series that we have on attitudes. We also don't know, for example, the differences, as Dario was saying, as Dr. Moreno was saying, what people from Pakistan feel about a particular issue versus what people from Iran, for example, right? Although about Iranians, for example, the fact that there are about 250,000 Iranians in California makes them probably one of the most studied groups, but yet still, when you start looking for studies on public opinion on Iranians, they're also few and far between. So an enormous field of growth, I think, and one which is going to begin to run into certain issues that I think are important. For example, if you look as something that you might want to model, right, is our knowledge, for example, of how Cuban Americans have evolved over the last 30 years. FIU, of course, has been engaged in some very interesting research, the FIU Cuba poll, which has largely looked at political attitudes of Cuban Americans. But it's been able to target Cuban Americans very specifically with large samples and follow these over now almost a 30-year period. So we know how Cuban Americans felt about critical issues like the embargo or opening up relations with Havana, for example. We don't have that same level of data for other Latino groups. We don't, but we speculate a lot. And I have a feeling that that's the same kind of thing that we have right now about Muslim Americans, and especially when you look at different groups. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and I think, as I said at the very beginning, we really need to start insisting on the better collection of data, even though that can be very sensitive. Some people might not want to be identified when they're registering to vote as Iranians or as Pakistanis or what have you. Very same way that some Hispanics don't want to be identified for their national origin because they feel that they're being discriminated against. And what we do know from, for example, is that the one data point, unified data point that we know is that Muslim Americans feel discriminated in the United States, right? And that Americans themselves believe that there is a great amount of discrimination against Muslims. And when you look at the differences between Democrats and Republicans, those who are Democrats believe that they discriminate, that there is less discrimination against Muslims than do Republicans. So I think there are so many different areas where public opinion research needs to be done. It's very incipient, and I think some of our colleagues are doing it, but we can't yet reach even the level of conclusions that we have about Hispanic Americans.
Okay, bottom line, a lot of work needs to be done, a lot of speculation on what Muslim Americans think. But Dr. Moreno, you were saying that you, in your 3 points that you talked about, there's competition for recognition, and not to mention there's a lack of cohesion. So we cannot take for granted what political party Muslim Americans will likely favor.
Well, I mean, if you look at the history of other ethnic groups in this country, they're very strategic about the use of political power. If you, the Irish Americans came to the United States and they registered as Democrats because the Brahmins in Boston were controlling the Republican Party. Cuban Americans became Republican, not because of the Bay of Pigs. That is inaccurate. In fact, up to 1978, a plurality of Cuban Americans were registered Democrats. But it was afterwards, it was with Reagan and when the Republican Party became a route for political empowerment that they became Republicans. But I want to make a point about data and finding out how Muslims think, if I can be so presumptuous. And I think one of the bases of all good research on ethnic groups is local voter data. And, one of the questions asked about, what do we know about Dearborn, Michigan, which is the largest concentration of Muslim voters in the United States. And I think that would be probably an interesting place to do the kind of deep voter analysis that you had in New Haven, Connecticut, that you had in Boston, that you have had in Miami, and combine that with public opinion polling. I do surveys as well as Dr. Gamara, but surveys can take you so far. Real votes are real data. And so I would urge, and it's be great if we can get some of our students at FIU to start thinking about doing PhD work on looking at Muslim voting behavior.
And I want to go to Afifa now. Afifa, what are you learning in terms of the younger generation versus the older generation for Muslim Americans? Because you have a divide there to add to the argument of the lack of cohesion in the Muslim American community as to which political party to favor.
Yeah, I think so. Younger voters are just like any other segmentation of American population, tend to be more democratic, right? So we see that amongst the younger voters that are 30, in that age bracket, they're like 56% Muslims who are like registered Democrats, right? And that ratio remains until you go in like 70 plus age population. Now we're talking about the Reagan era Republicans, like, the Republican Party that look really different from the party that is right now. And you see that gap is like, reduced over there. There's like around 30 plus percent of 70 plus year age, Muslim voters who are more Republicans, even though at that age bracket too, they are more Democrats than Republicans, right? So it's interesting to see that, like, the younger era, the gap is huge, right? And one of the reason is like, that younger voters tend to be more progressive leaning, more socially, economically liberal, but at the same time, the party is different also now. And like, they have used the narrative against Muslims too in their political narrative and their political campaigns. And that is like also you see the more clear division lines emerging than my, parents' generation and things like that too, right? Another interesting data point that I would like to discuss here is like, it's not easy to do a segmentation analysis of Muslim voters either, because, a religion question is not part of census, so we do not know how many Muslim voters are actually who live in Florida, right? So our estimation are based on, thanks to technology, on the name recognition, but we know many Muslim African American, for instance, that their names do not match the Arabic, the nomenclature frame that normally is associated with Muslim culture, or many Latino Muslims that their names are not recognized. So there's like, and then at the same time, there are many Latinos who have Latinx community who have Muslim sounding names, right? Like Omar and like, Fatima, like, we see that those names are common. So it's hard to analyze the Muslim data based on the voter file that normally we do access, right? So it's interesting, like, many data spectrums that we are on, and it will, one of my upcoming projects that I really want to do is like using digital technology to ensure that we expand outreach into communities in identification of where the Muslim voters are.
Sarah, I would like to bring you into the conversation. And what are your thoughts about the travel ban that was put in place by the president? Do you think that'll motivate some of the younger and even the older Muslim Americans to get out? Not to mention, Joe Biden made a concentrated effort, calling it the million Muslim vote, to get out and try to appeal to Muslim Americans. He says in his very first day in office, he's going to overturn the travel ban to try to sway some of the Muslim American voters to his side. What are your thoughts about that, Sarah?
Sarah, you're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you for reminding me. The vagaries of Zoom. So as I was saying when I was in mute that one of the interesting things about this Muslim ban is that it is actually fairly unpopular across the board. So the Institute of Social Policy and Understanding 2019 survey had this question about sort of how the Muslim ban plays with regards to, if an endorsement of the Muslim ban increases support for that candidate or decreases it. And one of the things that they found was that, of course, among Muslims, endorsing the Muslim ban severely decreases, support for the candidate, and it's actually decreases support for that candidate across other communities as well, not just Muslims. Of course, for Muslims, it's the highest sort of negative response. But so I think that overturning the Muslim ban is actually a very good political strategy, and it's a good thing just in terms of the policy itself and in terms of fairness, because the Muslim ban is actually having some serious effects in Muslim communities. We have people who have not been able to reunite with their families. We have people who have not been able to bring their wives over and their children over. They've been, literally separated by this ban for the better part of, 4 years. So this is not something that is just a theoretical, it really doesn't matter. The people who are over there just can't come here. They're actually, this ban cuts through people's communities and their lives and their families. And so, obviously, Muslim communities who are talking about it and who are, sort of sharing stories about how the ban is affecting them, has an impact. So Joe Biden's promise to remove it, I think is a good promise, and one that he can keep fairly easily with very low cost to him in terms of support, because it is fairly unpopular in general.
And Yasir, I want to bring you into it. And how does social media, or how could social media play a role in trying to get more Muslim Americans to give the dollars in order to become a more effective voting bloc?
Yeah, it plays a big role, but part of the issue with social media, as you discussed with Afifa, is social media tends to skew more young, right? And so the younger folks, you'll get with their dollars, but they don't have as many dollars as the older folks, and the older folks are less on social media. And so there's a tug and pull in terms of that effectiveness. It goes back to the question of cohesiveness and also homogeneity in terms of how Muslims think, right? Because we know, for example, owner of Jacksonville Jaguars is a Muslim man, Shad Khan, right? And he publicly donated $1 million to Donald Trump's campaign the last time around. And this time he hasn't made it public, but by all accounts, he has donated along with some other NFL owners. There are lots of large owners who give in terms of that, and we don't have a plug into them and to be able to say, why don't you give to Emgage PAC and let us figure out what the priorities are? Or why don't you give to this Muslim PAC and let them decide what the priorities are? Because that way the money carries with it some power and some asks. When you give to a single person on your own, it doesn't really carry, even if it's $1 million, it doesn't really carry the same weight, because if you're raising $1.5 billion in a quarter, what's that? What's $1 million worth out of that? It really, it's worth a lot. Don't get me wrong. $1 million is still a lot of money, but in the large frame of things, 10 million could sway things. 1 million, maybe. It depends on how it's going and to these political candidates and what the ask is in terms of what your money is, quote unquote, buying. Unfortunately, these are the terms we talk about politics these days, but it's a reality. The more money we can pool together, the better it would be. But how do we pool it together? I have this quick anecdote from the last Florida governor's race in 2018. During the primaries, Emgage endorsed Andrew Gillum. And Andrew Gillum was not a front runner. We endorsed him based on values, and we considered, okay, these are important values for the Muslim community. Not the entire Muslim community wanted that way. And so there were 3 other candidates who were stronger or looked stronger in the primaries. And there were doctors, for example, in Orlando who did their own fundraiser because they didn't want Andrew Gillum. And so they did their own fundraiser for another primary candidate. Now, that if Emgage PAC had that money whether it's bundled or direct, deposited, but in terms of Emgage PAC bringing those people to Andrew Gillum, that would have been a good ask in terms of, okay, look, we're bringing you all of this money. Now we would like a Muslim to be considered for a cabinet seat, right? For example, or we would like X, Y, and Z. These are the things important, but we couldn't make that happen because, the things that Professor Moreno and Professor Gamara have talked about in terms of the differences within the community that bring about these lack of cohesiveness.
I find it interesting. It's not just about raising the money. That's the first goal. But the second goal is just funneling it into one channel so that you can make the big ask. And Dr. Gamara, social media has completely changed the game for all of the candidates in terms of how to get out the vote, how to dissuade the vote, and we can go on and on and on.
Yes, in fact, one of the very, very controversial dimensions about the use of social media this cycle, and especially in terms of targeting specific communities, of course, is the way in which conspiracy theories show up in messaging by a major party, and so one of the very interesting dimensions of this is not only that these conspiracy theories, of course, are ones that everybody is talking about, the QAnon kinds of things, but the way in which they're translated, then sent via the variety of social media platforms, then internationalized into the diaspora communities, and the way in which they return to the United States and then appear again through talk radio in particular. All with, I think, a couple of objectives. On the one hand, frightening minority communities into voting for a specific candidate, right? Raising some of the very sensitive issues, in this case, socialism, of course. But at the same time, also trying to dissuade voters from turning out. So there's a dual purpose, which almost sounds contradictory. On the one hand, you want to mobilize people to vote for you, but at the same time, you want to scare people so that, in fact, they're so disgusted with the way in which politics is going on that they might actually stay home. So this, of course, leads to a whole very interesting set of questions of who regulates, or how can you regulate social media in the context of elections. And I imagine, I haven't done the research, but I imagine that the Muslim community is facing several similar things, right? There are conservative sectors within the Muslim community that are probably receiving some of these very same kinds of messages. And the issue then is, when Congress gets involved in this, or the president calls for, doing away with Section 230, and basically calling for the overt regulation of social media, that really then takes an entirely different plane. Social media is here to stay, but I think we're going to begin to see some greater and greater attempts at regulating it, because the companies that are involved in social media aren't doing a very good job of keeping out some of the untrue stories that are out there that circulate as facts.
And then when they do clamp down, the side that is being clamped down on complains that they're being picked on. So, so the argument goes on and on and on. I'm curious to find out, and this is for Afifa and Syra, that so what are the issues facing the Muslim American communities? Because in the Black community, it's pretty clear that it's Black women who drive the vote, which is why I think even today you have a Kamala Harris, who's now the running mate for Joe Biden, who obviously put the Black community, clearly put Joe Biden over the top in the primary in South Carolina. So what are the driving issues in the Muslim American community? Is it housing? Is it foreign policy with that new deal with the UAB and Bahrain with Israel? Is that an issue? I mean, what are the driving issues Syra and Afifa.
Sarah, you want to go first?
So, what drives Muslims? I mean, as we have all been saying, we're not a monolithic community, and we have some very deep disagreements with regards to what's important to our communities. But in terms of what's important to us sort of in our localities, all of these issues that you've pointed out, they're common across, minority communities in general. Education, housing, etc. is important. The ability to sort of, move around without being threatened. Hate crimes against Muslims has risen in 2018. It hit a decade high. So that's something that we see ongoing. That's just a constant source of concern in terms of civil rights and also just safety. And we've seen our mosques targeted in across the country. So those kinds of issues are important. The economy is important. Muslims in general, as an aggregate, tend to be economically better off, but this doesn't account for some of the very sort of discrete populations, for example, African-American Muslim populations, Bangladeshi Muslim populations that tend to be much poorer than the average sort of Muslim population. And, for those people, of course, economic issues and the social safety net matters. So, it's hard to say sort of in an aggregate way what drives Muslims. Maybe Afifa has a more sort of specific answer with regards to South Florida, but in general, we see all of these issues are important. Immigration is important. Muslim ban is important, even if it's not something that's personally important. It's important in the community. So I think that those are some of the things that will be motivating people. I hope will be motivating people to go to the polls.
Okay, so immigration, the Muslim ban, the economy, and Afifa, what are your thoughts for Muslim Americans specifically here in South Florida, say, versus obviously the folks in Michigan, the Muslim American community in Michigan is going to be dealing with a few other issues versus what we're dealing with here. All politics, after all, are local.
Yeah, so Florida will be pretty competitive to rest of the spectrum in terms of what are the priority issues for Muslim voters, right? One of the polls suggested that 35.5% of Muslims voters, that was the number one top issue for them was economy, right? And it makes sense also because Muslims tend to be more business owners, right? So they have their own businesses. They are more likely to own small businesses. Around 25% of Muslim population own their own businesses, right? So it makes sense for jobs and economy, just like any other voter. That's an issue, right? Foreign policy, of course, makes a huge difference, and especially related to the presidential election, right? But when we look at overall issues that Muslims care about, Muslim voters care about criminal justice issues too, right? And when you are talking to, especially around the younger generation, right? Because Muslim population is also trying to find political identity, right? So we align with African American brothers and sisters and their movements and struggles. We tend to, and especially in our younger generation, and that's why you'll see that there is more alignment there. And the movement for Black Lives Matter, Muslims take it as their issue too, because there's for racial diversity and its inclusion and some things that are Muslim, especially after 2016, especially after 9/11, they are facing that social exclusion too. So they stand up for those issues too. When you go into the local municipal elections, right? I am a mom. I have a 6-year-old son. The whole COVID-19 situation impacted and how it has, brought to attention the lack of funding for our K through 12 system or a higher education system. For me, that's an issue, right? So, and for many Muslim mothers and fathers who are concerned about education is an issue. hurricane does not exclusively target Muslim community, right? So we know when those issues come up, like climate change and environment, that impacts Floridian Muslims as much as it impacts any other community. Fortunately, environments do not discriminate. So we see that there is a lot of climate voters, in the Muslim community too, along with safety and security and all of those issues.
All great issues, and sounds to me like quite universal. All the issues that you discussed are issues that every community would like to see some sort of change or policy made. So now I'm going to open it up to some of the questions that we've been getting from some of our participants here. We had as many, we almost had 100 folks join us here, but Shabir, and I'll have this question go to Yasir. Even though the USA, we have separation of church and state, but evangelical Christians have always played the biggest role in elections and the selection of Supreme Court justices. Yasir, you want to take a stab at that, considering your legal background?
Sure. So I hate to answer any of Shabir's questions. I usually ignore them, as you do. But this time we'll answer them.
We love Shabir. We love Shabir.
Yes, it's true. Evangelical Christians, some Muslims look less to the evangelical Christian model and more to actually the Jewish model. Most Muslims that I speak with, they think the Jewish community is sort of a model immigrant community, and so Muslim community should model itself in terms of okay, we disagree on issues, but we can still be cohesive in terms of goals and asks. And going forward from there. So I agree that the evangelical Christian community has been very outspoken and has driven the conservative side of the issues. But the issue is that they drive mostly on social issues. Muslims used to be that way. Muslims were driven primarily by social conservative issues until 9/11 happened. And so the vast majority of Muslims, by all data accounts, voted for President Bush in that first election in 2000, right? And then 9/11 happened, and the two wars in Afghanistan and Iraq happened, and Muslims largely abandoned the Republican Party, even though the Republican Party was still promising all of the same issues in terms of social conservatism and fiscal conservatism, because there were several more issues that came to the forefront that were more pressing. And since that time, Democrats have been trying to get a larger and larger foothold in the Muslim community, and Republicans, by and large, haven't tried to court the Muslim vote. They really haven't. It's in fact, in some cases, Republicans have rejected the Muslim vote. There have been Republican candidates who have said, no, we don't want a Muslim endorsement because that would be bad for my base to see that I have Muslims endorsing me. And so in terms of, yes, Calvin, that actually happened. So in terms of cohesiveness, that's where the evangelical Christian group hasn't wavered. So if there was an issue, and I remember Professor Mesbahi, who's not on this panel, had asked a question a couple of years ago, what is that one unifying issue for Muslims that would drive all Muslims to one side or the other? And we haven't been able to find that single unifying string theory in Muslim voter relationship. So I think we're still looking for that. If there's one issue above all that could drive Muslim voters one way or the other, I think that would go a long way in terms of solidifying a voter bloc for a small minority like the Muslim community. But we haven't found that. And so that's where the split continues to happen.
Yeah, and Dr. Gamara, well, what I find interesting, and I read this as well, that Hillary Clinton apparently had sort of a hands-off approach to the Muslim American community. President Obama had a hands-off approach to the Muslim American community because he was labeled with being a Muslim and not a Christian. And Joe Biden has said, well, I'm going to do it, but I'm going to come after you, but only through a Zoom call. I'm not going to actually go to a mosque and come after your vote, which I found quite interesting. This question from Hassan says, after 9/11, nobody can deny the role of Muslim Americans on American foreign policy. How can you distinguish who is a Muslim? And do you believe that a Muslim can influence, or Muslims can have an influence on U.S. foreign policy. Dr. Mark, hey, you want to chime in on that, or do you want to lob that question to someone else?
I can chime in very briefly. I'll take the latter part. Look, the influence can also be negative, right? Not positive. and in fact,
That's true. That's true.
A lot of how American foreign policy has been designed over the last 2 decades has largely been because of the perceived negative influence, right? The Muslim is a perceived negative influence. The escalation of conflict in the Middle East is a perceived negative influence. In international relations, national security is defined by the impact of public opinion. And if we look at public opinion, especially after 9/11, it helped a lot in the articulation of what we all, I think, now agree that was a fairly poor foreign policy. We're still fighting wars that we should have never been in, but when those wars were started, they had an awful lot of American support, 90% in some polls, and a lot of it had to do with perceptions of the Muslim community and of the Arab world in general. So yes, I think that this is it's another way of looking at the answer to the question, but I think it's probably been more negative than positive, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's true. That's very true. And Afifa, I want to come to you with this question, even though Syra sort of tried to answer Christian online here. How are Muslims being targeted? And I assume Muslims being targeted as in candidates going after your vote.
Is it GeoTV targeting or targeting in the negative sense?
See, and Syra answered the question as in with the Washington Post article saying basically President Trump is his policies are not exactly in favor of the Muslim American community. Syra, did I get that correctly? You seem to have sent her a link.
That question popped up after I had sort of had made the remark that Muslims had been targeted by by these bans, etc., by policy initiatives in a negative way. So that's I took the question to mean that, as opposed to how is the Muslim population as a voting population targeted, which we could look at as well and is equally interesting. But
yeah. So
well, let's answer the positive and the negative. Okay.
yeah. Let me answer it both ways. Like for me, anyone who is working on the field, targeting means very different. It means how we are reaching out to the voters and how we looking at in that term, looking at Muslim population, Muslims tend to reside in mostly Democratic leaning areas, right? So Broward, we see that they're one of the largest population of Muslim voters. They reside in Broward County, also in Orange County, which is interesting because around surrounding Orange County, there are many flippable counties like Osceola and Seminole. We see a large number of Muslim population there too, and also Hillsborough community. Those are three counties where we have a large number of Muslims that reside in those areas. But interestingly, there are some counties that are flippable that are are targeted specifically to ensure that we are turning out from either ours are targeting that for the red counties, Democrats are trying to make it blue counties, those are Pinellas and Duval where Muslim communities reside. So of course we do GeoTV targeting in those communities to ensure that we are targeting Muslim votes. Now in terms of candidates and how they are reaching out to Muslim communities either negatively in some of the issues, then we see that they try to link the Democratic leaning candidates who are more favorable to Muslims by saying that they are associated with terrorism or they support the terrorists, right? And we have seen that in Donald Trump's some of the campaign ads, like, you know, they show the picture of Biden, but then show Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib and, like, you know, some of the progressive Muslim voices, like, you know, that this is the man behind. So there's, like, you know, using the subconscious mind of voters where the Muslim name is or Muslim images are, you know, linked with terrorism. Like, you know, we have seen that is coming up in imagery and ads and using the words such as terrorist and using the first extremist to go after the Muslim community, right? But on the other spectrum, like on the other side, when we have candidates who are realizing that, you know, Muslim votes matter, right? And they are a population that they definitely need. And we have seen there are so many of the Florida, especially around the House seats, that were won by Republican by 1% margin. And Muslims can be that 1% margin in those counties. We have seen, like, there's more engagement. They're coming to our mosques. They're talking to the leaders more effectively. They're trying to understand the issues that the Muslim community stand up for. So there's multiple level of targeting going on. I hope I answered such a broad word.
Okay. All right, Afifa, thank you very much. We were scheduled to go to 1:15, but we'll go for a few minutes after, only because we started a little late and we're getting a lot of questions. And so, Naveed, I want to say I've been told to make sure that I emphasize that here in South Florida, there has been an effort to forge alliances between the different groups and the different, I don't want to call them different segments of the Muslim American community. So I do agree with you. I've worked with Cosmos here for the last almost 10, 12 years, if not longer, and I have seen the different groups come together. So I want to focus here on Nassan. He asked another question, and let's have our answers go a little bit more quickly, only because we don't have a lot of time. Dr. Gumar, I'll begin with you. What is the effect of the Muslim ban on this election? I think Cyrus sort of answered that, but very quickly, do you want to expound on that so we can try to get through all of these?
Very, very quickly. That, you know, of course, it has been used by both sides. The Democrats, of course, sort of using the Muslim ban as a portrait of how intolerant this administration has been to immigrants of all colors, of all places, and so on. So it has been used in, I would say, a somewhat effective way by the Democrats to illustrate how bad immigration policy has been. At the same time, and this is of course very interesting, it's how the Republicans use the immigration ban as a sort of a good policy, right? You know, it's the entirely other side of the equation. They look at it as a policy that worked, a policy that was effective, you know, in terms of the stated objectives of keeping terrorists out. Of course, there's no evidence whatsoever of any terrorist that was kept out as a result of the Muslim ban, but it works with the base. Remember that this administration is focused on its base, and those messages work well with their base.
Dr. Umar, thank you. And Syra or Afifa or even Yasir, do we have any data in reference to Dearborn, Michigan, which is the most populous Muslim city in the U.S. regards to the voter turnout in the past elections? And Dr. Umar, even you, do we have any of that, Syra? I'll begin with you. Do we have any data, Afifa?
I'm sure there is data out there. I don't know it off the top of my head where we would find that, but it is as we know that it was a battleground state in 2016, and a lot was said afterwards with regards to whether, the low Muslim turnout in 2016 made a difference. So I'm sure that people have been collecting data. I just don't know where to find it. Anyone else? Afifa, Yasser?
Yeah, there is data. I do not have it handy here, but I dropped my email address there. Emgage has like a very proactive chapter in Michigan, and they are doing some amazing work in getting the Muslim voter turnout there. so I can always get that data. So I dropped my email address there.
Okay, and you see what exactly this is coming from Nasir. It is what is it exactly that we need to have in our Muslim community in America more united, cohesive, and organized, keeping in view their different sectarian affiliations within Islam and their varying national backgrounds. Please throw light on why do we lack strong Muslim political leadership in the U.S., especially in the form of young leaders. Yasir, take a stab at that for Nasir.
I think that was true as of a couple of years ago. I don't know if that's true anymore. I think we have strong national Muslim leadership in terms of the political arena. We have 3 congresspeople sitting, right? 2 congresswomen and a congressman sitting who are Muslim. We have a state's attorney general who is a former congressman who is also Muslim. We have in the state of Florida our first state representative who is Muslim, Christopher Benjamin. We have other up and coming local elections that are Muslims are running for, and some succeeding, mostly failing, but learning through the process. And most of these are young people that are learning and succeeding, and even if it's failing, at least they're learning. So I think that question is a couple of years ago, that would have been more true. Now we're more and more politically savvy, more Muslims. For example, a Muslim man ran Bernie Sanders' campaign. He was the head of Bernie Sanders' campaign, right? And so these are positions that are being filled by young Muslim leaders who are then eventually going to turn that into political success at a very, very bigger national stage. We'll have a senator soon enough. We'll maybe have a president one day, I think, hopefully after a woman president, hopefully on the Republican side, but hopefully a woman president. And then, you know, who knows? That'll be there.
Yeah,
the former congressman from Minnesota. The former congressman from Minnesota, correct? Yeah, is now over the George Floyd investigation in Minnesota.
Yeah, and the state attorney, and even in like very conservative states like Tennessee, we have like, you know, a council member, who is like a Muslim. So we are seeing that emerging. We're seeing that, especially from the young people, there is activism. And I would quickly want to talk about what Naveed was talking about. Like this is like, you know, one of the first time, like, you know, a lot of organizations in the community who are coming together. We are doing a very major Muslim Voters Day in South Florida in the Tri-County area on October 23rd after Friday. In a lot of masajid, we have more than 15 masajid along with South Florida Muslim Federation and Emgage who are turning out the vote. So we'll see, inshallah, more activism.
Okay, and so we're going to wrap it up here, but I want to give, since we have just a couple more minutes here, I want to give each panelist a chance, about 60 seconds here, to give your final thoughts, final push, as we are now about 2 weeks away from Election Day, probably the most historic election in my lifetime, easily, and I'm sure for each of you. Dr. Gumar, I'll begin with you.
Well, I hope you haven't voted. Please vote. That's probably the most important. But I just want to have one very brief reflection on the particularly the public opinion dimension here of how Muslims might see. What's interesting when you look at the Hispanic community and how it differentiates from how African Americans have mobilized, especially Florida Hispanics, and this is. You know, Florida Hispanics don't identify with the civil rights struggle of African Americans as much as, for example, Mexicans might. Florida Hispanics are really driven by what I call the American dream kind of ideal. And a lot of it has to do with the way in which, you know, maybe it's that, you know, Hispanic Americans can kind of blend in and, you know, without their last name, they can play white, be white. They you know, they sign off as white on the bureaucratic forms. But I think, you know, what's interesting, especially, you know, we talked about the ban, we talked about 9/11 and so on. It appears to me, and I'd love to hear more on this, or at least more research on this. It appears to me that the Muslim has a much better opportunity to coalesce with African Americans and to coalesce around the civil rights issues where Hispanics don't. And I think in that sense, maybe there's room for greater political success because otherwise it's if in listening, for example, to Iranian Americans the other night on CNN, conservative Iranian Americans, I was a little reminded of some of my conservative Hispanic friends that some Iranian Americans really believe in the American dream and discount what the civil rights struggle was all about. Okay, so let me leave it on that.
Wow. 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 Thank you, Dr. Gamar. Always compelling. Thank you very much. Syra, your turn.
Yeah, so I think following right along with that, I want to remind everybody that the Muslim American community has a very large African American population that we oftentimes discount. And I think that is a mistake. And it's unfortunate because we should be including them at every step of the way in all aspects of our activism and our planning. And we should be learning from them because those Muslims in the African American community have been here since before the founding of this country. And in fact, I don't know if anyone has read the Moor's Last Account based on Estevanico. Is a Moor, a slave who came with the Spanish conquistadors. And, so there have been Muslims on these shores since Spanish times and since the advent of slavery. So yes, I think that Professor Gamara is absolutely correct that there is much opportunity here that I think we are building on, and that the younger generation is definitely, I think, building on in terms of being more expansive and inclusive and not considering the Muslim community of being just the immigrant community, and so I think, my view is, as I said in my opening remarks, that, taking that history seriously and taking that struggle seriously, I think Muslims, need to engage in the civil rights aspects of sort of our history, and also need to, be more proactive in terms of their own engagement with broader and different communities, and including the growing Hispanic Muslim community, which it is also growing exponentially. So I think there's a lot of hope and possibility. And I guess I will end by saying, go do your civic duty, which is to exercise the vote that has been hard fought for and won for you.
Great points. Thank you. And I was reading last night, of the 3.5 million Muslim Americans living in the U.S., 1/5 are Black Americans. So that is a great point. And so, Afifa Khalik, I will send it over to you. Your turn.
Yeah. So I would just like to say that, there are issues with any community. There are issues with Muslim communities. There are so many things that we need to learn about. But I'm so proud of my Muslim sisters and brothers, and especially sisters, for their leadership and that role that they are playing in building a political platform for the Muslim community, and especially over past 10 years, a lot of work that has been done. And it's through the selfless struggle of many Muslims who are involved and engaged over a broad spectrum Muslim organizations. I'm I would love to thank all of them, and especially our young Muslims and young Muslim Democrats, and even if there are some Republicans that Yasir may know, right? But I'd like to thank all of them, because it takes a community, it takes a village to develop that political platform. And in the end, I just would like to remind everyone, and I will use this opportunity. October 23rd is the Muslim Voters Day. It's happening in all of the masajid, almost all of the masajid. If you do not have information, go on www.soflowmuslims.com/Muslim Voters Day. Emgage and South Florida Muslim Federation are a partner on that and turning out a huge Muslim votes. There will be many elected officials, and we will have fun and we'll vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Afifa. Really appreciate you. And Yasir, you are the anchor. You're bringing up the rear. You are the caboose. The final 60 seconds. Yes, sir. You have the floor.
I really think it's important to remember, and I keep harping on this today, is, voting is important. Obviously, everybody's emphasized that. So go vote. It doesn't matter what party, doesn't matter what your issue is, from local to national and everywhere in between, vote. If you haven't done the research, lots of groups, including Emgage, put out cards of recommended ballots in terms of, okay, follow this if you don't want to do the research yourself. But equally as important is to go one step further and donate to a candidate. It really is important. I know it may seem like a ridiculous thing when a candidate is raising $100,000 for you to donate $10, but it's not ridiculous, because if 20 people, 30 people, 100 people get together and donate $10, it really makes a difference. If you ask for, then if you later on, if that person gets elected and you ask for FaceTime with that person, they will know who you are. They will want to meet with you. They will want to hear your concerns. However small or big those concerns are, it's important. And as I said, that's for every race. That's small school board race to whatever, commission, county commission, all the way to the president. You need to talk with your dollars. The Supreme Court has said dollars is speech, right? We know that now as a matter of law. Unfortunately or fortunately, we need to speak with dollars as much as with our votes. And it's really critical that you get in touch with people like Afifa and myself and figure out how you can help the PAC side of the event, because that will move us further in terms of getting political power for the Muslim community, not just the right people in power, but also have a say while they are in power. And that's very important, because without money, we can't hold them accountable. Really, the votes hold them accountable 4 years later. The money holds them accountable almost immediately. It's very important. So I'd like to emphasize that as much as possible.
Yasir Blue, Afifa Khalik, Simon Chaudry, and Dr. Moreno, who had to leave early, and Eduardo Camara. Thank you all for being a part of this panel discussion, Muslim vote in 2020 elections. It's happy to serve as moderator. I'll see you on television tonight at 4, 5, 6, and 11 o'clock. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Calvin.
Thank you.
Thank you, Calvin.
All right. Take care. All right. See you on Local 10.